Thank you. As Judy so clearly showed, these things take a long time. And there are advances and retreats, but that story was one of small victories, some of them bigger victories, leading all in the same direction. I'm going to talk about a project that ran around the time of the Sydney Olympics, because what evolved from that project at that time, I think, is still highly relevant. Don't have any slides of wonderful underwater scenes. This is about government and government structures, but obviously the way we make decisions and the way we make policy is critical to the kind of progress and the kind of successes that are achievable. The project was the setting up or the appointment of a Sydney Harbour manager and the establishment of an independent office of Sydney Harbour manager. A great deal happened out of that. Judy mentioned some of those things, and I'll mention them briefly, but I'm just going to focus on the decision-making aspects that came out of it, how government policy is made and develops and how government policy is implemented. I've got a paper that was delivered to the Coastal Solutions Conference of 2003, which details some of this and which gives you my email or one of my email addresses. And so if you want to follow any of this up and follow up some of the documents, including the ones that Judy mentioned, get this paper from me, and it will give you the leads and the references to that. And as I say, I'll give you all my email address. It's there, so that if you want to follow up some of these matters, please do. As I said, I'm going to focus on making decisions and making policy about really complex places, and somewhere could not be more complex than Sydney Harbour. It's in the centre of a big complex city. It's right at the heart of a big complex city, at the centre of the economy, and as well it's the most complex, interesting and unusual water body, surrounded by equally unusual and land communities and so on. So this is one of the more complex places that policies are developed. In fact, it's an extremely complex place to begin to understand, and the decision-making structure that exists around it is extremely complicated as well. But the standard way of governing these sorts of places is to have a boss of some kind and a decision-making entity of some kind, as presented very simply there. The boss might be a premier or a cabinet or a commissioner or an agency or a statutory authority and so on. And then who makes the ultimate decision, and then or in whose name the decision is made. And then there is the decision maker, which is usually some kind of group of people sitting around a table, a board or a committee or a council or a cabinet, and those people sitting around the table, typically in the standard model, particularly in the planning area, particularly the people that were involved in the production of all those planning documents that Judy referred to, are often seen as representatives. It might be local government. You bump a mayor onto this body to represent local government. Someone from business, someone from the environment movement, someone from tourism, depending on the issue, an indigenous representative, depending on the issue, a farmer or a miner or someone from the transport industry, this is the way it is normally done. You must have been involved, sat on, seen operating any number of these sorts of bodies. And they're supposed to be somehow representative. In reality, this is largely window dressing in terms of representativeness and so on. It's not to say it doesn't sometimes work. After I was Sydney Harbour Manager, I went to the West Australian Planning Commission, and one of the characteristics of the West Australian Planning Commission as an independent expert statutory body with dedicated funding, real money and real power and a certain degree of independence and a long life as well. It was originally set up in 1955. So that was a really good model, and it used lots of committees of this kind. And in that case, as an independent statutory body, using lots of committees, it worked well because it kept the Commission grounded, it kept the Commission in touch with real life, and it also meant that what the Commission was doing was known about outside the walls, that a whole lot of people from different walks of life were involved in the work of the Commission, knew what was going on and how it worked. In that case, it was actually a very positive component. There are other times where one would want strong executive action. In the last few weeks, we've been being reminded of what happened in 1972, for instance, when Whitlam and Barnard formed a government of their own, and between them had every ministerial portfolio and got on with things and made lots of immediate executive decisions, and things happened really fast. Sometimes that's not a bad way to go. And there are other times where having an expert authority of some kind with autonomy and power to act is also a better model than the normal one we have, which is where we have a minister, a political head who wants to make all the decisions and is guided by a body which is supposed to be representative and makes it look respectable, even though, as I say, it's often window dressing. In the kind of complex issue of a Sydney Marine Park, or ways in which we move towards a Sydney Marine Park, just knowing what needs to be known, just knowing who's involved, just knowing what the boundaries and limits and exclusions and conditions for such a thing would be, cannot possibly be done this way. An immediate problem is that these people sitting around, these people sitting around the table are not obviously representative. They're not accountable. They are probably told that what goes on in the committee is in camera, and they're not to go back to their so-called interest groups and report back, because what's happening is confidential around the table. They don't report back. They're not appointed by these different interest groups, local government, farming, conservation and so on, that they're supposed to represent. They don't actually represent them at all. The next problem is that because of the way they're appointed, they, on any real issue or difficult issue or tough issue, they can't reach agreement, they can't reach consensus. In a way, they've been put there not to. It's a recipe for not reaching consensus. What they can agree on is the highest level motherhood statement, like Sydney Harbour would be the best place in the world or something. Beyond that, as it gets more and more concrete and specific, they almost by definition can't agree. In any event, these interests are not singular. There is no one local government interest. In fact, the local government bodies involved in this issue are probably all fighting and have quite different policies on whatever question it is. Likewise, the so-called environment movement, likewise the so-called business movement, where you've actually got different aspects of business which are in fierce competition. So so actually these interests are many more than they are represented to be. And indeed, there are then even more again who are not even considered to be represented. So this is in fact a way not to make decisions, a way that information can't be gathered, policy cannot be developed, and decisions can't be made. And yet this is the model, basically, that we all follow, essentially with the minister at the top and these sorts of bodies in various levels of government below that. What happens under these conditions, and if one thinks of this range of overlapping, synergistic, conflicting interests in what I'm going to say about the Sydney Harbour Manager experience, you bear that in mind, that because these interests are not organised and because they're not mobilised and because they're not really represented at all, there is simply a competition for attention, a competition for resources, a competition to be amongst all those to be involved. What this situation encourages, and this was certainly the case in the whole issue of Sydney Harbour leading up to the Olympics, was that there is it encourages these various interests to compete. It encourages ambit claims to be made. It encourages extreme positions to be taken. And the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald in the 90s was full of this sort of contention. And that in the end was what led to the setting up of the Sydney Harbour Manager. I didn't realise it at the time, but basically Bob Carr wanted to take all this contention off the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald. And that's what you get under this normal way of doing business. Carr announced that there would be a Sydney Harbour Manager, and this was giving the appearance in a way that someone would be in charge of the whole thing. So in a way it was not a new model at all that he was setting up. It was a specific model for Sydney Harbour like this for the boss. And the press welcomed my appointment with, at last, for the first time since Arthur Phillip, someone's in charge. That was exactly not what it was actually all about. And I went for this job on the basis that it was a very up-to-date new model, that it was innovative, far-sighted, visionary, and so on. The selection committee happened to be unusual in that it had Tom Uren on it and John Mant and a few others. So in fact they weren't seeing it in this terms at all. And I got appointed, and not seeing it the way the Premier saw it. I thought it was a reflection of the currents that were being discussed in academia at the time, that were prominent in the relatively new Blair government, of developing policy outside government, of developing inclusive policy networks, of involving civil society in governance and so on. And that's how I set about it. And fortunately my innocence lasted the full 3 years, and I continued to carry on that way throughout. With all this going on, it resolved over the first year or so that there were in fact 6 clusters of interests: government, local government, industry, sport, public interest group, indigenous communities and science, and that all of the main players, all of the people with a stake in Sydney Harbour more or less resolved one way or another into those clusters. So there they are. There was both state and national government. There were the local government councils within the catchment of Sydney Harbour. There was the industry and sport cluster, which was basically everyone, commercially and non-commercially, who regarded Sydney Harbour as a resource or an input into their activity. The public interest groups, all of whom one way or another saw it as a public asset. There were the various indigenous communities and interests, and finally there was essentially a scientific or research interest. There were 20 state agencies and 3 federal ones. There were 27 local authorities with a foot in the Sydney Harbour catchment. It resolved down to the 22 substantially or entirely within the Sydney Harbour catchment, and 21 of them got together without the City of Sydney, and most of the mayors who gathered around without Lord Mayor Sartor thought that was probably a good thing. There was an industry group that was emerging already at the time to represent particularly the shipping, boating and marine construction area. There were the various NGOs and action groups, the indigenous communities, and we found 77 different research teams operating around in various institutions working on aspects related to Sydney Harbour. These were the bodies that emerged over time. More or less from top to bottom was the chronology in which they emerged, and more or less from top to bottom was the formality they arrived at in the 3 years. The top one worked well as a serious coming together of heads of agencies, chaired by the Deputy Director General of the Premier's Department. Sydney Harbour councils got together as a strong grouping of the 21 councils, chaired by the previous Governor Gordon Samuel. Having the right chair and having the right look was really important to make all this work, and so those bodies were formed. Each over time, in a very organic way, during this 3 years, produced their own defining document or foundation document, and as I say, Judy mentioned a couple of them, and they are described in more detail in the paper if anyone wishes to take it. What happened was that these clusters emerged because the various interests, of whom there were very many, and in many ways they were in conflict. For instance, the people that rowed on Sydney Harbour wanted calm water, and the people that did maritime construction and boating didn't. And yet they had more in common, and they could form a common cause more than with the others outside their cluster. And they really did recognise the interest they had in common and their ability to negotiate as a group. This is what all this turned into, which I described as the Sydney Harbour model. Those are I haven't mentioned the Catchment Management Board, which happened independently, wasn't even the Sydney Harbour catchment, but it happened, and so it was incorporated into the Sydney Harbour model as something that existed. So these 6 plus the Catchment Management Board formed 7 clusters of interest. The diagram deliberately doesn't show it as a structure. It deliberately doesn't show hard lines around it. These are just pools or networks or swirls in the water. It deliberately doesn't show organisational lines or a hierarchy. But what it enables is, for instance, local government to talk to state government. Prior to that, it really wasn't possible. One council might talk to one department. Here, they could talk to them, and the result was progress with the Sydney Harbour Regional Environmental Plan. it meant that industry could talk to local government, and they needed to. There was a lot going on between there. Previously, it just meant one or two particular industries or firms or whatever, or rowing clubs or something would talk to one or two councils. Under this arrangement, they could talk to them. Individuals within this cluster could talk to individuals within that cluster on the basis of this structure, and so on. The Nature Conservation Council sort of auspiced this. This meant that the researchers could talk to each other and could talk to their targets, etc., could disseminate what they were doing. This was an authoritative network of indigenous interests that could speak for the harbour. I discovered at the end that, as I implied, that all the Premier really wanted out of this was to take it off the front pages. The only way to get it off the front pages is, in fact, to give people access, to give them, to put in place a governance structure that would actually work. And it rapidly went off the front pages, not because of news management, but because people could see that there was a governance structure, that there was access, that there was transparency, and so on. My final point would be that this kind of so-called Sydney Harbour model can work in many complex places. It takes the old hierarchical model of boss and decision-making body and all those disorganized interests. It turns it inside out. It organizes the interests, and many have been mentioned this morning, who have a stake one way or another in Sydney Harbour marine environment. It puts the emphasis on organising these logical, organically emerging interests, to put them in a position to negotiate, so that these interests can negotiate with some entity called the New South Wales Government, for instance. It's a model that applies to this particular issue and to very many others. It means that there is a greater degree of access, of transparency, of information sharing, the capacity to negotiate, and to reach policy recommendations and decisions. Thank you.